thank you very much for inviting our group here to talk. I'm going to talk about our in-situ drift-corrected pressure measurements at Axial volcano. And we have a time span from 2018 to actually last week, 2023. I think it's still working. This is our self-calibrated pressure recorder in the ocean bottom. It's at Central Caldera at Axial. Here's a cable that's running over to the junction box at Central Caldera. It's sort of on a pretty rocky outcrop here in the caldera, and in fact, you can see that this sphere is about half a meter across. It's titanium. So let's see. Next. So let me back up just a little bit and talk about the pressure sensing element that we use in the actually it's used a lot in this business. So this is the Bourdon tube, first patented in 1849 by Eugene Bourdon. It's essentially a hollow tube. It's closed over at one end, open at the other. Pressurized fluid fills the tube. As the pressure increases within the fluid, the tube tends to straighten up, it deforms. Bourdon's insight was that the displacement of the end of the tube is a very good monotonic measure of the pressure within the fluid itself. So here's kind of a picture of the Bourdon tube, just an illustration. There's a mechanical linkage that detects, amplifies, and converts that signal into something that humans can read, namely the position of a pointer on a dial. Okay, it's a very simple device. They still make them every day. You can go ahead and buy it. It's great. There's nothing wrong with it. Oops. Okay. So now let's go to the parascientific gauge, which has been the focus of so much of the talk, so many of the talks here. Fairly small device, about 108 millimeters long, 35 millimeters in diameter. Buried within the parascientific gauge itself is actually a Bourdon tube. With Jerry Parris's insight in 1972, that's about the patent, is that the sensing mechanism is a resonant quartz crystal, of a quartz crystal beam. Essentially, when the crystal is excited, it has a resonant frequency of somewhere around 30 kilohertz, more or less. As the Bourdon tube is pressurized and it adds stress to the end of the tube, stretches or contracts the crystal, and the stress changes the output resonant frequency of the crystal itself. And so in this particular case, it's about 4 megapascals per kilohertz. So the transfer function for one particular type of gauge. Now, this I think is a plot that's very familiar to people, but hasn't been put up yet. And this is Pulser et al. That just went through a review of a number of different gauges on the seafloor and showed that it's not an ensemble of gauges, assuming no geodetic signal. It does not average to 0. It's some other number. There's quite a bit of variability within the gauges themselves that they study, and they have a variety of behaviors. Some go up, some go down, they go back up. They have different scales. And I think, getting the presentations that Randy Watts has made, it's a really difficult thing. You can't pre-stress a gauge and expect it to maintain that afterwards. You can't sort of put one on the rack and age them like a nice ham, expect it to have low drift. And for that matter, if you deploy them, bring them back, they're sitting on the shelf for a year or whatever, this exponential term, which we hope, it's variable length, it could be restarted. And it can also behave in an entirely different way. So your basic laboratory calibration doesn't have a whole lot of impact on trying to understand what the gauge is going to do going forward at a new point. So what to do? Well, so there was a paper, Monk et al., about strategies for improving feature measurements of low frequency sea level change. And they brought up the idea that one thing to do is in-situ calibrate these gauges. And we use a device known as a deadweight tester, also known as a testing gauge. Conceptually, it's really very simple. Imagine sort of a piston here of area A. It is supporting another mass, the total mass is M. It fits into this closely fitting cylinder here. You fill the cylinder up with some working fluid, could be a gas for that matter. You pressurize the fluid until you float this piston assembly And then you can say that it's simply a force balance that, the hydraulic force pressure over the area is matched or balanced by the gravitational force M times G. So pretty easily show that P is equal to mg over 8. M, G, and A are all things that you can go ahead and measure. So in that sense, and in fact, you can do that in an absolute sense if you use well-known standards of length, of mass, and of time. You need the G, and it's 1 over T squared sort of thing. So this looks very simple, and if you are really, really careful, you could argue about the real answer to this. You can show repeatability on the order of a few parts per million. The accuracy, depending on who you talk to, what you buy, can get you down to maybe 40, 50, 60 parts per million. Okay, and these are all features that are actually piston gauges are systems that are studied by a number of national metrology laboratories. There's quite a bit of background information and research going on the systems and the systematic errors. So with care, we think that you can go forward. I'm just not going to really dwell on this one, but you can so here's mg over A, but we need to make corrections. We say the buoyancy of the masses within the atmosphere that they're operated at. You need to control for the thermal expansion and contraction of the piston cylinder assembly. There's actually a distortion term where it's a squeeze on the cylinder or actually pull it apart. So all of these need to be controlled, and also we operate in that one atmosphere more or less. We need to measure that as well. You can operate these things in a vacuum, but depending on the resolution that you get, you need to get down to 0.01 kilopascal to better maintain that. You can buy systems with a belt jar and it's got a vacuum pump, and it'll pull out all the air for you. So we decided to go ahead and try to deploy one of these things on the ocean bottom. We bought a commercial piston cylinder assembly. This is a tungsten carbide cylinder, and it's actually kind of an amazing thing. Circularity of it is probably good to about a micron. It's mirror bright, it's polished in sort of submicron finishes. It's actually, I went to the factory, you can see the technicians working on it, and they're lacking these things with progressively finer grades of diamond rouge. It's something like polishing a telescope here. And it is fitting into another tungsten carbide cylinder with sort of like micron level clearances between the two of them. And then there's some assemblies that sort of hold the pressure cap together. This thing helps hold up the masses that support it. This whole thing, by the way, is about 0.2 kilograms. And there's other bits and pieces that go onto it. So schematically, this is what is in our self-calibrating pressure gauge. We have 2 quartz parascientific gauges that are chained together in the T, they're on the same manifold. There's a valve that most of the time, 99% of the time, it's looking at the C4 pressure when it's deployed. Infrequently, say now maybe 4 times a year, we activate piston gauge system. There's another valve that we use the C pressure acting on an oil reservoir to actually charge and lift this thing up. Then we turn it, and there's another fun thing about this piston gauge. You need to spin it. And the reason for that is that the static friction of this piston acting in the cylinder is quite large. It's got a lot of thermal effects. It'll sort of wander around all by itself quite a bit. The shear friction, once it's rotating, is orders of magnitude less, and it's basically negligible at sort of the 2 parts per million level. So you turn this thing on, and you need to level this thing as well, because if you have it off tilt, the effective value of gravity is going to be less. So we have a gimbal system, tilt meters, and so on to get this thing vertical. So there are pictures of various incarnations, but this is sort of a autonomous system with battery packs, emergency transponder, and encrypted transponder to get the data back. This is some other version we have sitting up there. This is about 0.4 meters across, thereabouts. It's a lot of stuff. But anyway, so we deployed one system, again, the one that was shown in the first slide in 2018. And we did calibrations on a regular interval, sort of very quickly at the beginning of the measurement, then sort of decreasing about once a quarter at the end. So we see here, taken off an offset, these are the 2 gauges, and they are measuring the calibration pressure. We believe that we know what the calibration pressure is. The calibration pressure is essentially invariant. We don't play with the maths sitting in there. We monitor all the other effects. It's actually really good in the sense that at the seafloor, the temperature variation were 1,500 meters down. Maybe 10, 20 millikelvin tops. And so it's extremely stable. And so you can see I have sort of gauge 1, gauge 2, and went ahead and fit the linear exponential curve on this. This is sort of a least squares fit. It's actually not very well constrained, but you can see here that the fit is actually matching the data pretty darn well. There's why there are fairly small residuals in it. We want to look at the residuals. This is what we have. The fit for gauge 1, about 0.064 kilopascals, about 6 millimeters. The other one is something like 5 millimeters in the residuals here. So they're all following line. One thing that's interesting, if you note, is that the gauges are coherent. So if they go up, they go down, they go up, they go down, they follow each other pretty well for the most part. What I think that is that we're not perfectly monitoring and modeling dead weight pressure gauge. And that, you might have a little bit of error in the temperature that we're recording with the platinum resistant thermometer. It didn't get quite the hydraulic head right because we have LVDs that monitor it. There may be some other effects we don't quite understand. But those calibration pressures are common mode to gauges. But anyway, the fit of this nice line is about the order of sub-centimeter. So now here's the here's the other thing. We have if you take 2 gauges, again, 99% of the time they're monitoring sea level pressure. So if we just take 1 minus 2, subtracting this a time series, all the common mode oceanographic effects fall out, right? They're seeing the same thing, so we think. So what you're left with is the shot noise, the electronic noise of each gauge, the uncorrelated noise by definition, but also whatever the difference is in their drift behavior. It's not the curves there, but the difference between the 2 curves. So it's not too surprising, it goes somewhere. If you take and apply the drift correction and then take the differences, you end up with this red curve here. So the peak-to-peak variation of this red curve is about 13 millimeters. Okay, that's sort of top to bottom. The RMS of this curve, red curve here, is about 0.024 kilopascals, 2.4 millimeters. So in some sense, these gauges, as one measure, they're having sub-centimeter tracking. So this is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the efficacy of this calibration measurement. It should take out the difference in the drift between the 2 gauges. They could still have a common mode drift. We still don't understand. We can't prove that in this testimony. And there's something else about this that kind of bothers me is that you see a really coherent pattern. You go down, comes up, goes around like that. They're consistently varying. If you want to go back, you look at this curve here, you draw this line, you see a little bit up there, a little bit up there. And maybe kind of dangerously, you think, could I draw a different line? Not just the exponential linear, but if you have a little more structure, again, an empirical fit, by being simple-minded, t squared, something else, just some sort of descriptor of the drift curve, other than linear and exponential, that would better fit both the calibration data, but also reduce the variance in the drift. You can see again, this is like 0.5 kilopascals. Okay, like 5 centimeters of equivalent variation just in the calibration curves themselves. And then this thing here again, we're on the sub-centimeter level here. So differences are really pointing out there's a much higher resolution. You can see these really small structure changes over the period of calibration.
Yeah, could I ask so you need a frequency counter basically for each of the cross gauges. Is it the same standard that is used for these or different?
We use the parascientific controller points or little like things over here at the model. So that's what we actually are using. We telemeter the serial data back. That's what generates measures of frequencies, converts it to a serial data stream, and we transmit that thing directly back to the OOI network infrastructure.
They're two independent
oscillators.
oscillators, okay, yeah, so the size and steps and so on going along there, it might be caused by a single counter, but it's not.
Yeah, and I don't actually understand it. Other people have seen little steps. It puzzles me as to what they're due to. There was a suggestion Spar made a while ago that, part of your total error budget could be due to drift into controller electronics, right? It's got its own crystal oscillator, it's measuring a time-based frequency. Fair enough. And we did an experiment on a totally different project where we looked at the control frequency, if you will, the reference frequency of these parascientific controllers versus an atomic clock, the rubidium atomic standard. And I didn't see any apparent drift at sort of the millimeter level. I can't quite remember the number, but it's actually a really darn good oscillator. So that, I think, is not a major contributor to the drift of the parasite, not the transduction electronics of the system. So taking all of this is sort of what we've still been playing with, is that you take those two pressure records, correct them for the drift, and then just say to interpret, what does this mean in terms of uplift at Axial caldera? And there's a lot more work that I need to do on this, but in general, talking with, say, Bill, Chad, and everyone else, these are all in agreement with the Cable Observatory gratuitously low drift pressure gauge out there is consistent with sort of the mobile pressure recorder control or remote reference site. And I think it is largely consistent with sort of the A0A experiments Will Wilcox talked about yesterday, also in the same area. So you have three separate methods, if you will, that begin to show consistent results. So that's, I think, is a useful thing. And kind of going back, do the same thing everyone did. So a while back, I was getting bored. I went to the library. This is the early 20s. God, we need a new project. We need to do something different, exciting, and cool. I went to the Scripps library when we had a Scripps library. And as we wandered around and sat around the library, going through the stacks the old school way, and I ran across this paper. And one thing about it was they said, oh my God, this is really hard. Complicated system, you got to prove it, it's going to take time, it's going to be expensive. I was thinking like, oh yeah? Turns out they were absolutely right. Okay, now, oops. This is something you can ask an advocate about. Now, the thing about the cable SCPR is that we have this dead weight tester, which can be referenced to national standards. We don't actually have to do all that much work because when you put a mass in, we get sort of an inexpensive scale, measure the mass and say, okay, we're done. We know it's not going to be changing. We're not like scraping metal off of this. I would know that if it happened. Okay, I think it's going to come to a screaming halt. Yeah, so you can trace all of this. And in principle, you could remake another instrument, take care of all your, cross your T's, dot your I's, measure the masses, measure the piston areas, do all of this. And you create an instrument that is reproducible and recreatable, if you will. So now we have a system that if this thing disappeared, you can make another one and do all of that, and you still reference back to fundamental standards of mass, length, time. Mass now is actually defined in terms of the Planck constant. A really complicated experiment. Matt Cook is a person to ask. Well, we've done transects, one transect across the subduction zone. And the same idea we're talking about. We have these benchmarks in the ocean bottom that are in place. We have this device. We worry actually about the hydraulic height of the instrument above the benchmark. In principle, we can come back with a different instrument. Actually, we still have this one in the lab. We can repeat these measurements, begin to make very long scale, decadal, maybe open-ended observations of the pressure on these benchmarks to make some, to have a control on the subduction deformation of the vertical plane. Yeah. And just to close, there's a couple of pictures. This is the device on the Jason RV, if you're familiar with it. You know, it's on the low front force thing there. So the ROV dives down, puts it down there. We sit on the benchmark for about 2 hours. Is that right, Pat?
Yeah.
And we actually alternate between calibration and pressure. There's a lot of interesting nuances Matt can talk to you about. And this is sort of a different kind of benchmark. It's triangular. We're trying to get sort of an anti-trawl system here so that that's one of the dangers of these long-term benchmarks, not just the stability, but watching them get wiped out. And this is what we hope will work better. Okay, thank you.